because we're still talking about this oral cavity, we saw that last day that terrible drawing in the textbook of the tongue that was flipped upside down. So we're starting this journey that the food is going to be taking to go from the oral cavity all the way through the rest of the GI tract. So because the food is running into this saliva, the secretions coming from the salivary glands in the mouth, that's why we're talking about it here. Another structure that the food is going to run into in the oral cavity, of course, is going to be the tongue. And so the tongue is a muscular, it's a skeletal muscle. It's actually a group of skeletal muscles that you are going to have voluntary control over. And we know that, of course, it is that skeletal muscle, mucous membrane that's going to be covering the surface of it. And of course has those taste buds located on those papillae, those little ridges that you can see here. And we talked quite a bit about this physiology of taste last semester when we were looking at our special senses. So our focus now is not going to be on taste, but instead more on the mechanical aspects of the tongue and how the tongue is going to help us in terms of being able to speak and the movement that is required for changing the shape of the tongue to speak, but then also to be able to move food around in the oral cavity itself. So it turns out that the tongue is going to be controlled by two different groups of muscles, two different classes of muscles. We have extrinsic muscles, which are going to be located on the outside of the tongue. They're going to be able to direct the movement and the shape of the tongue from the outside of the tongue, which means that they're anchored onto points other than the tongue itself. Things like the hyoid bone, the mandible, the hard palate, the styloid process, all of these muscles here that are going to help to control the movement of the tongue, essentially from the outside of the tongue. And so this then is going to allow for some pretty specific movements that the tongue can make. So if you stick your tongue out or pull your tongue back in, those are extrinsic muscles that are going to be responsible for doing that. Okay, so we're not talking about changing the shape of the tongue, we're talking about the movement of the tongue itself. So sticking your tongue out, moving your tongue from side to side, whether you're sticking it out or whether it's in your oral cavity, you move your tongue from side to side inside your mouth, those are extrinsic muscles that are going to be responsible for controlling that. So that is going to help to facilitate chewing, because of course, if you want your teeth to actually do their job of mechanical digestion, what did we say mechanical digestion is?
Chewing.
Okay, chewing is an example of mechanical digestion, but what is it actually? Yeah, mixing or churning or grinding, breaking down big chunks of food into smaller chunks of food, not that chemical digestion where we're breaking down individual molecules, but just breaking stuff from large chunks into smaller chunks. So if you want your teeth to be able to have that chewing action happen, well then you rely on your tongue to move the food in between your teeth so that you can actually have that mastication or that chewing take place. So your tongue is important in being able to have that mechanical digestion taking place in your mouth. And then as we will see when we talk about deglutition, or this idea of swallowing, that we do require that the tongue is going to be moving in a posterior direction to get that food moving towards the posterior aspect of the oral cavity. All right, so these are the extrinsic muscles attached to structures outside the tongue. But we also have intrinsic muscles of the tongue. And these are going to be muscle fibers that have their origin and their insertion, so both of their connection points on either end of the muscle fibers are going to be anchored within the tongue itself, so fully contained inside the tongue and anchored on the connective tissue in the tongue itself. And so now we're talking about this muscle that you can see right in here that is going to help to be able to change the shape of the tongue. So we have to be able to change the shape of the tongue. We need to be able to make it narrower or wider or flatter, and these are all going to be movements that are required in order for us to be able to make the sounds that we want to make. Right? So if you make the T sound, think about what your tongue is doing when you're making the T sound. It's just the tip of your tongue on the back of your teeth, right, on the posterior aspect of your teeth. Your whole tongue is not squished up against the back of your teeth, it's just the tip of your tongue. If you're going to be doing things like swallowing, you try to kind of imagine you're swallowing right now, start that process, but notice what your tongue is doing. It's going to push to the roof of your mouth, and then it's going to work its way posterior. So it kind of forms this big glob of tongue, and then works its way in a posterior direction to kind of sweep the contents of the oral cavity posteriorly. So we have to be able to change the shape of the tongue, and to do that is these intrinsic muscles. Okay, so extrinsic muscles allow tongue movement, okay, whereas the intrinsic muscles change the shape of the tongue itself. All right, so when we're talking then about the digestion that's happening in the mouth, because we're talking about the tongue and this idea of helping this process of chewing, of course there is going to be that mechanical digestion that's taking place. This is called mastication. So your masseter muscles are going to be involved in this and being able to kind of break down those bigger chunks of food into smaller chunks of food, and then mixing that food together with our saliva. And when we do that, when we have this mixing of the food with our saliva, we now no longer call it food, we call it a bolus. So you're going to run into this word bolus a number of different places and in a number of different contexts. So you're going to see later on in your clinical courses that if you're giving someone a big volume of something all at once, you're giving them a bolus. Okay, well that's another way of using this word. When we're talking about the digestive system, a bolus is this mixture of the food that you've ingested with the saliva. Okay, so again, we change its name. We're going to see that we change the name as we go along, as we mix it with the different secretions coming from the digestive system. So here we have food, now becomes a bolus once it mixes with that saliva. We also have some chemical digestion that's going to take place in the mouth. We know that chemical digestion is going to rely on what? Enzymes. And so we know that from last week's conversation about saliva, that saliva is going to contain a couple of different digestive enzymes. And so one of our digestive enzymes that we have is going to be our salivary amylase. So amylase is going to be a type of enzyme that breaks down starches or big long chain carbohydrates. Now you can test this yourself to prove to yourself that you actually do have this digestive enzyme in your saliva. You could take a soda cracker, so like one of those little saltine crackers that you get, with your soup or whatever. Just take one of those crackers or two of those crackers, and probably the unsalted ones will work a little bit better. And you just chew them. Just chew them. Keep mixing. You're making that bolus, and you just keep chewing it and chewing it. Don't swallow it. You're going to be tempted like 3 chews and then swallow. No, just chewing, pushing it around, and it's going to kind of take on this consistency of kind of almost like glue, and it's going to be really sticky, and really just keep chewing it. And it's going to be a while. It's going to take a while because, as we said, there's not a lot of this enzyme in your saliva. We said saliva is 99.5% water, and then all of the other components that are in saliva make up only 0.5% of the volume. So there's really not a lot of it. But if you give it time, and we're talking like 20 minutes, so if you keep chewing that cracker, keep chewing that cracker for like 20 minutes, eventually, what will you start to taste? Sweet. You will start to taste sweet because the salivary amylase has now had time to work and break down the starch, the carbohydrates in that cracker. And when we break down carbohydrates, what are the building blocks? What are the end products of digestion of carbohydrates? Sugars. So when we're talking about sugars, then you all of a sudden are having sugar, now free sugar in your mouth, and you can taste that as being your sweet taste. So it's kind of a disgusting experiment, maybe less disgusting than the string one that we were talking about before. But again, if you're interested, it does take some time because that concentration is so low. Yeah, sorry guys. Yeah, it's just, no, it's not. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so lingual lipase. So we also have that lingual lipase, which is that fat digesting enzyme that's in our saliva as well. So this is going to begin the process of breaking down our dietary fats. But again, it's not super efficient. And for the most part, like most of the time, you're not chewing your food for 20 minutes before you swallow it. So the reality is that these enzymes are not going to be doing a whole lot in terms of actual digestion of our food. Yes, they're there in very small quantities, but you don't let them work for very long before then you swallow that bolus down into the stomach, and those enzymes are no longer going to be active because they're going to be essentially destroyed by the acid in your stomach. So they're not super effective. They might get the process a little bit started, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, there's not a ton of this taking place. Okay, so we've got these two different types of digestion that are going to be taking place in the mouth. As we go through the different components of the digestive system, the stomach and into the small and large intestine, we're going to look at both of these types of digestion to see what's going on in all of these different places. So lots of mechanical digestion happening in the mouth, a little bit of chemical digestion, but because there's so little of that enzyme, not a ton of it is going to be happening there. This then brings us to our next process, which is deglutition, or the mechanical act of swallowing. And it turns out that there's 3 phases. And you think in your head, like, well, how hard is it to just swallow? Like, how can there be 3 different steps in swallowing? Don't I just swallow and it's done? Well, yes, there is a part that you get to decide when it's going to happen. That's the first part. That's the voluntary phase of deglutition. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the background that you don't even know about, that you're not even really aware of. And we'll kind of take our slow, stepwise process through this over the next couple of minutes, so that hopefully for the rest of the day here, you're going to be able to kind of think to yourself every time you're eating your sandwich or drinking your tea or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, let's do what's happening. And now there's a signal being sent to the swallowing center of my brain stem. And like, oh yeah, look at my uvula, my soft palate is moving against the posterior wall as you're eating all of that food. So the next phase is then, after you decide, I am now going to swallow this piece